The main story of Shattered Space is, if we're being completely honest, a little bit underwhelming in quite a few ways. But there is another side to this story which is a whole lot more interesting. Not just because it changes the context of your journey on Varun Kai, but also because of the implications for the rest of Starfield's universe. As is often the case in Starfield, finding the right context completely transforms the narrative for the better. And the stories bubbling beneath the surface or recorded in the past are among the most interesting that the game has to offer. While I was disappointed at first that Shattered Space didn't explore House Varun's history enough, or even portray the faction in the way most of us were expecting, there are a lot of answers to be found on Varun Kai, including a single confiscated recording found on a data slate in an unassuming dressing room and recoverable only during a single quest, which provided the most all-round amusing and bewildering moment in my entire playthrough. So what is the truth bubbling beneath the surface of Varun Kai? What can whispers and data slates tell us about this faction and its mysterious founder? What questions can be answered and what new ones have been raised? And most importantly, what is the other side to this story which makes this planet a much more interesting place than these squabbling houses and vortex creatures would lead you to believe? Obviously, there will be spoilers ahead.
I have been asked to represent the Council in this moment. Please, enter our city. You have my word that you will not be harmed.
From the moment the player arrives on Varun Kai, House Varun is already doomed. The city of Dazra, once the centre of a thriving, if slightly unhinged society, has been reduced to a crater, with only a few houses and shops left around the perimeter. The scaled citadel, previously the city's crown jewel, is shrouded in a cosmic energy field and surrounded by rocky terrain. Those caught in the blast radius have been transformed into violent blue phantoms, including the majority of Dazra's nobility and its leaders. Anasko Varun, grandson of House Varun's founder, is the only ghost still capable of conversation, and he seems hellbent on finishing the nonsense he started. Meanwhile, those forced by necessity into leading the faction are inexperienced, unqualified, and utterly disoriented. So much so that the first random person who arrives on their planet is quickly rushed through House Varun induction and sent out on a quest to save the day. And all that happens, apparently, because the player is the only one capable of hearing what Anasko is raving about when he materializes at the spaceport. Why exactly that is, I don't know for sure. Maybe getting friendly with the phantoms on the Varun star station was enough to make it possible, though I think it's more likely that touching a single artifact at the start of the game is actually what imbues the player with the previously unknown hearing vortex phantom people power. Unfortunately though, this power won't come in handy anywhere else in the game. Regardless, this power does mean that the player is quickly considered the chosen one on Varun Kai, and is tasked with uniting the houses, saving Anasko, and restoring the citadel to its former glory. That's the way it's sold to us, at least. But in actual fact, Shattered Space's main quest is a whistle-stop tour of the dysfunctional, arrogant, and deluded citizens of a decaying and hostile world. Take a trip to House Vithal and their leader will offer his help so long as you murder his apparently dishonorable son first. Visit House Kadik and you'll be asked to rescue some hostages in order to help them avoid some tricky negotiations. Or, if you want to listen to their council representative, you might prefer to kill those hostages just to be safe. House Dulkef is definitely the most well-adjusted, helpful group, but their obvious weakness is their proclivity for inaction. And then of course you have the Zealots, who are just as unreasonably violent and utterly insane as they are in the rest of the game. In dealing with each of these houses, you have the opportunity to save some lives and sacrifice others, but whichever route is taken, you are never ultimately setting them on a good path. You're just staving off further drama in aid of finishing the big laser and getting inside the Citadel. These houses are apparently desperate to save Anasko so that they have a leader again to tell them what to do, but they can't set aside their differences to achieve the one thing that might help. I certainly found myself asking an obvious question. Why on earth am I running errands for these people so that they agree to help me do something that is only going to help them? Here's the thing though. Even though most of the dialogue choices are more about adding flavour than they are about influencing anything, there are two very distinct paths presented to the player to handle the Va'ruun people. The first is that of a Va'ruun loyalist. From early on, you can commit wholeheartedly to the Great Serpent and, in every quest, speak like you've been on Va'ruun Kai all your life, condemning the non-believers and strictly abiding by the scriptures. Taking this path, I think, results in a very disappointing journey through the Va'ruun homeworld. For that critical aforementioned point, that House Va'ruun is falling apart, and you are joining at the worst possible time. The other path is that of a space tourist or mercenary, roaming the planet in search of opportunity while caring little for the Va'ruun way of life, repeatedly dismissing the people as irrational and their beliefs as misguided. Though I tend to think that most people would be drawn towards the Va'ruun loyalist route, this Merc path is a whole lot more interesting and entertaining. And frankly, it feels much closer aligned to the story that is actually told. This much is obvious from the way events ultimately culminate in a disastrous ending, no matter what you choose to do in the story.
Have you abandoned me, Great Serpent? Do you not hear my pleas?
Along with its bickering houses, House Va'ruun's leader, Anasko Va'ruun, is in a sad state of affairs too. Obviously, for a start, he's been a lot more blue lately than he used to be. And from your meetings with him during the main quest, it's clear that he's become obsessed with his mad scientist experiments in the Citadel. But based on messages left on the terminal in his office, it's even sadder than that. Ever since taking over from his father, he has been fumbling around, entirely unsure how to lead his people, ultimately leading to his research and eventual attempts at seeking guidance from the Great Serpent itself. These experiments, though, carrying on from Jinan Va'ruun's own work, transformed his goal into making teleporting super soldiers and resuming the Serpent's crusade instead. And in seeking answers and demanding results, his arrogance has cost half a city and countless lives. And he doesn't even seem that bothered about it, because much like any of the faithfuls on Va'ruun Kai, he believes that anything that happens is the Serpent's will and definitely not anybody's fault. Anasko isn't responsible for killing his people because it's what the Space Snake wanted. Obviously though, in reality, he is not a good guy and is largely responsible for the demise of House Va'ruun. As you attempt to save him anyway though, you'll eventually convince the Va'ruun houses to help and build the giant laser that zaps a hole in the energy field around the Citadel. Then you can finally waltz right in and catch up with your space ghost buddy Anasko on his home turf. And then, once you find yourself on the reactor level, you'll discover his army of teleporting space ghosts and be given the choice between helping him deploy these super soldiers or terminating their life support. If you wish to take the Va'ruun loyalist route, you'll agree to help Anasko with his army before heading toward the Citadel's pinnacle, where you can choose to be a good little House Va'ruunite and sacrifice your life so that Anasko can finish what he started. This is technically a sort of ending, but because you're agreeing to die here, the game will just reload to when you entered the room as if you'd been killed in combat. You don't even get a short cutscene. Still, this is clearly the right choice if you're following the scriptures, so if you want this to be your canon ending, you just have to quit the game here and never come back to that save file. You can see then why this path through Shattered Space is ultimately pretty disappointing. If you decide you want to stay living here though, then you will have no choice but to fight Anasko and destroy his Vortex soldier machine, obliterating the Citadel in the process. If you choose to take the Varun-hating Merc path from the start, however, then killing off Anasko's super soldiers and going on to fight him at the pinnacle makes a lot more sense. Either way, with the scaled citadel gone for good, the player wakes up surrounded by the sad remains of the High Council, who are pretty disappointed to learn that the random visitor they asked to save the day has instead blown more stuff up. After they berate you for a moment, you're given two choices to make. The first of these is who you think should become House Varun's new speaker, or de facto leader. And the second is whether you think they should initiate the Serpent's Crusade 2 Electric Boogaloo, starting a new campaign of violence against the settled systems. Obviously, whether or not you tell them to start a war here is a pretty clear good or evil choice. And actually, credit where credit is due, it's probably one of the very few places in the game where you can make a choice that is unequivocally bad, because there is basically no justification for actually choosing war in this instance other than wanting chaos. If you were a true Varun loyalist who initially released Anasko's super soldiers and supported him in his endeavour, then you also would have sacrificed your life instead of fighting him. Regardless, I do think this is one of, if not the biggest choice, story-wise, that the player gets to make across the entire game. That said, much like the decisions the player has to make at the end of all the other faction questlines in Starfield, this won't have an obvious impact on the rest of the game, at least insofar as I can tell. In fact, your choice doesn't even seem to be represented in the Unity, like the other faction questlines are, which is unfortunate. When I spoke about Starfield's Vanguard questline before, some people pointed out in the comments that it's possible to see Achilles pop up on random planets if you pick that option. So it would have been nice if we could see at least a few more House Varun ship attacks in the game if you pick the option to restart the Serpent's Crusade. As for the choice of houses, Dulkef seems like the obvious best decision if you really want some semblance of peace on the planet, but honestly, the most fitting option here, following the space tourist mercenary path, is telling them that House Varun is dead and that it should stay that way. If you do so, they won't give you the option of restarting the Serpent's Crusade, so presumably that doesn't happen without the player passing on Anasko's wishes. But what does happen is pretty dramatic. All of your unfinished Varun-Kai quests will instantly fail, and while they let you leave the planet safely, they warn that if you return you will be an enemy of House Varun, and they really do mean it. I tried to pop back down to Dazra after realizing I had accidentally left behind a snow globe which had sentimental value, and found myself with no option but to kill dozens of guards and scientists to reach it. Much like the Crimson Fleet questline is great because it allows you to befriend an enemy faction, I love having this option in the game to make myself the enemy of an entire planet. As much as this ending is a little bit annoying if you had quests to finish, it honestly feels to me like the most appropriate conclusion to this story. Though do be warned that Andrasia will have a pretty visceral reaction to your decision. The thing is though, it's pretty clear that the House Varun these people knew and loved is dead, and pretending otherwise just feels a bit silly. There is seemingly no one left on this planet capable of uniting the people and rebuilding better. These three squabbling lunatics are so thoroughly unqualified to lead such a faction that they will agree to revive the Serpent's Crusade with almost no hesitation, simply because the player tells them that was what Anasko wanted. Despite the fact that their society is probably in the worst state it's ever been in, they will willingly march towards war just because some random spacefarer tells them they probably should. With the death of Anasko Varun, the faction's link back to its founder is gone. With the destruction of the Citadel and the city, its greatest minds, leaders, and places have disappeared. Just about everything which made House Varun so powerful and special has been lost. And that is the saddest part about Shattered Space by far. This story's greatest gift to the player, however, is something quite special. Shattered Space makes you, the player, the one and only life in the universe privy to the secrets of House Varun and its founder, Jinan, including some data slates found inside the Scaled Citadel before it's destroyed, which completely recontextualize the faction's history.
Yes, it's recording.
My eyes are open!
We made a jump, and one of the passengers is... I don't even know. This guy has been like this for hours.
That confiscated recording of Jinan Varun shortly after his apparent encounter with the Great Serpent certainly makes House Varun's founder seem a bit less enlightened and a lot more utterly insane. Its inclusion in Shattered Space, in a bedroom on the floor below Anasko Varun's office in the Scaled Citadel, is nothing if not fascinating. The mere fact that it was confiscated should tell you just how much House Varun's leadership didn't want the general populace to listen to this audio, despite its obvious importance as a record of the moments directly following Jinan's meeting with the Great Serpent. It's not that it directly contradicts his descriptions of his experience so much as it makes him seem less like a prophet and more like a madman. 3 additional data slates which can be found in Anasko's office, as well as other details in the Scaled Citadel and in the secret lab under the Malene Dam, provide even more context. At some point after his post-grav jump breakdown, Jinan's winning personality began to convince the other passengers on the colony ship that his experience was very real. And in time, his faith in the Great Serpent was enough to gain complete control over this tight-knit group of colonists, and expand into the theocracy that was House Varun. I am now pretty confident that Jinan Varun's spiritual experience during his colony ship's grav jump was somehow that of reaching the Unity. How exactly that happened is a lot more difficult to explain. In the same way it's difficult to understand how Victor Aza lost 12 days to the Unity after touching a single artifact. It would make some sense if there had been an artifact on the colony ship, but as far as I can tell that wasn't the case. My best attempt at an explanation is simply that fundamental to grav drive technology is this touching of the beyond. No grav jump occurs without reaching into the void and brushing past the infinite, so it doesn't take much more than the right circumstances to push someone further, briefly, into the Unity. Either way, Jinan Varun's descriptions of his experience are basically a one-to-one match to what the player sees when entering the Unity, except with added snake flavor. The snake thing, then, could be seen a few different ways. In the simplest terms, I think it's probably just a different interpretation of the Unity itself. The Great Serpent could simply be this loop at the center of creation, or some shape formed by a galaxy or a constellation. You could definitely pick out the shape of a snake somewhere here in the cosmos if you really wanted to. Or, here's a more fun and ridiculous theory for you. What if Jinan Varun was wearing a snake costume when he was briefly transported to the Unity? after having attended an Earth animal themed party on his colony's ship. And so, when he saw himself there in the Unity, he was also wearing a snake costume. And then he presumably translated that as being the Great Serpent. I think it's probably not that, but it would be a highly amusing explanation that doesn't seem to conflict with anything we already know. We also know from Varun scripture found elsewhere in the game that Janan Varun met and fought the Pilgrim, aka the Hunter, aka Keeper Aquilus, on several occasions, dubbing him the Unbeliever, presumably for his attempts at convincing Janan that his interpretation of the Unity was a bit wacky, and that he should really be focused on the artifacts instead. We know then that Janan specifically denied the truth that we can find in Starfield's main story, fixating instead on his own wild ideas while focusing his research efforts on grav drive technology. Janan might not have known enough to know why grav jumps are important, but he was certainly in the right area. Because of his interpretation of the Great Beyond, though, he never found the answers that the player can find, and so his cult grew with some knowledge of the Great Beyond, but without ever really understanding it. I don't personally think that Janan Varun himself was ever Starborn, because I think if he was, then he would have set his people to task collecting the artifacts, and they don't seem especially interested in them. Either way, I think it's clear that Janan touched the Unity in some form, but maybe he didn't quite get all the way there, given that his artifact collection wasn't even close to what the rest of us needed to get there. It's also hard to imagine when he would have found the opportunity to go off and become Starborn in the timeline leading up to House Varun's founding. And if he's not Starborn, then he's basically just some guy who got a glimpse of the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and took it in completely the wrong direction, while refusing any other possibility beyond the one he was convinced was the truth: that a giant space snake was calling the shots. Going into Shattered Space, I had hoped that House Varun would be just as cool, if not cooler, than their mysterious lore had made them seem in the base game. I didn't want to visit a civilization in collapse. I wanted to see it at the height of its power, and be fully convinced that this was the coolest cult in the galaxy. But instead, I found myself baffled by their ineptitude and apathy. And while that was unexpected and disappointing at first, I enjoyed this story a whole lot more when I stopped believing that the Great Serpent had a plan, and instead realized that this entire faith was based on less celestial knowledge than I as the player had gathered in the first hour of the game. It's important for a game like Starfield that the player has some degree of choice in these stories, and it's unfortunate when any single path is notably better than the other. But here, I think that is the case, and choosing to be a House Varun loyalist is just a lot less rewarding than it should be. In the end, the story of House Varun is that of a madman who forms a cult, builds a society, and sends countless men and women out to die in the name of a god he is never fully able to understand. Upon his death, and without his leadership, his society begins to fade into obscurity, until his grandson pushes too far in a relentless quest to reach back into the Great Beyond, and his hubris almost completely destroys what remains of the original House Varun. The player's role in this story is to act as the final nail in the coffin, and to be the last person to know the truth. The last being to know the secrets of Janan Varun and why it is that his society fell apart at the seams. The player is there to bear witness to the end, and no matter how you choose to finish Shattered Space's story, the heart of House Varun will be lost in the process. If you loved or hated Shattered Space's main story, let me know down in the comments. And please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more stories and more video games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.